on blast.
This is week 7 of I'll Name This Football Pod later on the On Blast Podcast Network. Available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Google Play, and on YouTube. Tell your friends. My name is Sheldon Alexander, and as always, I'm joined by my dude, Mr. Matt Russell, sports betting professional and host of the Window Sports Betting Podcast. Mr. Russell, how are you doing heading into week 7, my dude?
Good. Week 6 was, by and large, outstanding. On Sunday, it was a crush fest and literally swept the board 6-0. But
Woo!
just when you think that you've got this league figured out, they throw a couple of Monday games your way and you lose both of them. So overall, right, if you had told me, okay, you'd be 6-1 on your big bets, you'd be sort of 9-3 overall, you'd be like, yeah, I'll take that, right? But the NFL always has to give you that little sour taste in your mouth at the end to just be like, just hang on there, big cat. You got to just cool it a little bit. So overall, outstanding, but we do have a little vengeance in our eyes just from that Monday night.
I love it, my dude. And you know what? Last week's pod, and you know, this is a thing that's super interesting to me. So last week overall, my overall record is 6-8, right? All last week. Lost the last 2 games on Monday night, which we'll get to for sure. We'll spend some time discussing that for sure. But the funny thing is, my feel in terms of the picks and how I feel about each team and the games and the picks being made is still pretty good. And that's different for me, right? And so I'm putting the trust in the long-term feel of everything and still above 500 for the season, which is the goal, and I'll take that for sure. But it was so funny to think the things that I was really right about last week felt good. Bang on. We crushed some shit last week for sure. Yeah. And then there's some other things which I guess proves the point of why you laugh at me for making public picks and picking every single game. Because it is ridiculous. But this is the fun, and this is why we're here doing it, right?
Yeah, and like those 12 games that were played on Sunday, right? I talked about how like we went 6-0 on the big bets released on our Sunday podcast over at the Window. And, you know, you go 6-0, well, there was 12 games. It's like, yeah, because I don't have to pick all 12 games. And those other 6, I went 3-3, right?
Yeah,
so I sort of, you know, trimmed the fat, so to speak, got rid of those sort of 500-y, could go either way type stuff, and was able to really lock in. As you say, like, you're really seeing the ball well, right? Like, it's more of a baseball term, right? We're in the World Series right now, but, you know, you're seeing the ball well. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a hit every time. Sometimes you're going to line out to the third baseman, you know, that kind of stuff. But if you're seeing the ball well long-term, right, you can keep this momentum going. And I like where you're at, along with where I'm at as well.
For sure. Yeah. So, and again, what we're trying to do here, I just try to make a pick for every single game, trying to win more than I lose. Mr. Russell comes through, poke some holes in a lot of the public narratives that I'm going to bring up as we get through each game. And the end goal for Mr. Russell's end is to try to help us all win some money. That's what we're doing here on the podcast. It still doesn't really have a name, but I'll name this football pod later. Seems to be working well. I feel good about it. The On Blast Network is still rolling. So let's do this, right?
Yeah.
And speaking of rolling, I don't know if either of these teams are rolling, but we talked about the crap fest of games on Monday night. And now we're heading into a Thursday night, and it's the Eagles and Giants. And it seems like we got to start our discussion on week 7, talking about the NFC least. Eagles are 4.5-point favorites at home on Thursday night to the Giants. And the winner of this game would be tied with the Cowboys for first place in the division. I didn't see anything that makes me want to ride with Daniel Jones. But one thing I did learn from last week, Carson Wentz isn't going to stop trying to put up points. Whether he's successful or not, their offense is just go, go, go. I know I should probably be leaning towards taking the points, but if you're asking me which side do I want to be on at the end of a game, rooting for a score to cover, I just don't want to be in a position where I'm rooting for Daniel Jones. So I'm on the Eagles. But what is your take of this absolute just trash factory of a Thursday night game?
Well, for the second straight week, I'm going to throw a curveball at you. You'll remember
Woo!
last week, you wanted to start Tampa Bay, Green Bay. It's the big game of the week. Headliner, let's get into it, right? We didn't even have a Thursday nighter, so easy decision, Tampa Bay, Green Bay. And normally we save a couple of things for the end of the podcast, right? One, in the case of last week, is the sucker bet of the week. I turned it on you. I said, guess what? The sucker bet of the week is this big game between the Bays, right?
Okay.
This week, I'm flipping it in a different way. This week's survivor pick is the Philadelphia Eagles in the Circa Survivor. So hang on to your hats for that one. So if you're listening to this podcast and the game is going on right now, just know that I am completely catatonic throughout this entire game. I don't even know. It doesn't really matter what the score is. It is going to be absolutely brutal. We're down to about 350 out of the original 1,390. So over 75% are out of Circus Survivor. Things are getting interesting. We're going to have to make some moves here, and we're starting tonight. The Eagles, they're going down in weight class, right? We sort of talk about that on a weekly basis, right? If you've played a bunch of tough teams, then you play an easier team, it's going to feel like all of your plays are working a lot better. And when you play the Steelers and the Ravens, and then all of a sudden the Giants show up, it's going to feel for the Eagles like their plays are working. Like, why didn't this work last week? And it's like, obviously. And when you're not dealing with Lamar Jackson, when you're not dealing with Ben Roethlisberger throwing it all over the field, Daniel Jones is quite the step down. Now, you can make the case that the Giants have played some really, tough teams as well, and maybe this is a little bit easier, but the Washington football team isn't one of those teams. And so last week they go and they get their win. And when I say their win, it might be their only win all season, because this Giants team, even in that win, did not look good at all, right? Got an early score, early touchdown, and then basically didn't do anything the rest of the game. And so the yards per play, we talk about sort of how we measure things after the fact. And for offenses and defenses, it's yards per play, right? How efficient are you? Well, the Giants have not cracked 5 yards per play all season long. You can go up and down their box scores, and it's 4.5, 4.7, 4.8, 4.6, all across the board. The last 2 weeks against pretty good teams in the Steelers and the Ravens, the Eagles have been in the high 5s, 5.7, 5.8. Not a huge number, right? Because sort of the league average is around 5.5.
Yeah.
But at least it's slightly above average against some really good teams. And now you're going up against a Giants team that has hung in games, right? So people are thinking that this is a competitive team, but just offensively, that just hasn't been the case, right? Even against the Cowboys, whose defense is pretty bad, like they move the ball a little bit, but you look at Daniel Jones's numbers, right? And this guy's barely cracking 220, 230 yards. He's a little bit of a threat on the ground. And so the way this line has moved, it opened 6.5, before this past weekend, right? That was the look ahead line. Opened this week at 6. Miles Sanders was ruled out and Zach Ertz was ruled out. So a lot of people kind of freaked out, and the line dropped to 3.5. Well, the bettors out there sat and went, we're not moving a line on a running back. We're not moving a line on a guy who was like catching one ball for 8 yards pretty frequently this season. So why would we move this line down from 6, 6.5, all the way down to 3.5? And so the lines pop back up to 4.5 because that was such a ridiculous adjustment, right? And so now we're looking at this team going, you know what? Like, this Giants team just still isn't very good right now. And the Eagles, for as much as their lack of success, let's just call it, has sort of, prevailed in the media, it's a team that believes that they can win this division. They're looking around going like, we're better than them. We're better than them. And then they watch that Monday night game and they're like, we're definitely better than them. And so it's like, okay, there's no reason that they're not going to show up for this game. In general, Thursday nighters favor the favorite. They favor the home team, rookie coach with a short week to prepare. And a couple of guys that the Eagles are getting back. Lane Johnson, way more critical to their offensive success than Miles Sanders, right? Nobody has Lane Johnson on their fantasy team, but that doesn't mean that he's not more important, right? Same thing with Deshaun Jackson. He's returning. Now there's some skepticism about how long he might actually play because we've seen him come back run 3 routes, pull a hamstring, and then be out of there again. But he will do more to sort of affect, in general, the offense in a positive way than just having Zach Ertz out there at this point. So we like the Eagles. A lot of it's sort of strategic based, right? So you have to sort of listen to the podcast to get a deeper dive into that. But yeah, the Eagles are the survivor pick. I talked earlier in the week on the podcast about getting that 3.5, loving that a lot. 4.5, right? We're starting to, we're no longer getting the best of the number, but we're still getting better than that look ahead line of 6.5. And I just don't think there's been anything that's happened in the last week, even with the Sanders and Ertz injuries, that would make that, it still should be 6, right? At the very least.
Totally. And again, I know we'll reference it a bunch of different times throughout this podcast, but of course, if you are not listening to Mr. Russell's The Window sports betting podcast, you're missing out because there's gems being handed out all week long. So for sure, he's going to come here, sprinkle some info here and there, but the real meat, the real steak, the sizzle, it's on The Window podcast. So go check that out.
We're cleaning it right off the bone. Right off the bone, we're cleaning it over there.
So yeah, the Eagles, it's just I just don't see, I don't want to be in a position where I'm rooting for the Giants in this game. It's as simple as it sounds. And I know I come with the Joe Public take on this pod, but that's as Joe Public as it gets. I'm not going to be here rooting for Daniel Jones in the Giants offense. It's not about that life. So sticking with the NFC least, the aforementioned first place Dallas Cowboys, who have allowed the 4th most points in NFL history through 6 games of a season, right? Your first place Dallas Cowboys, quarterbacked by the one, the only Andy Dalton, who couldn't have looked worse. Zeke.
Well, I'm going to hang on a second. I thought he was okay.
Hold on.
Like, everybody trashes Andy Dalton, and I'm not here for that. I'm not here for that.
Andy Dalton, who looked like Andy Dalton. How about that?
Yeah, okay. Serviceable NFL quarterback. Absolutely.
Okay, fair. I was getting to the point of crushing Zeke, who really is the one who deserves to be crushed, who I last week was sitting here saying, we need to feed Zeke, let Zeke cook. What did I say? Pound the rock straight up the gut, nothing fancy about it. You know what Zeke was feeding? Zeke was feeding the turf with footballs with all his fumbles, costing the team the game. Horrible loss for the Cowboys on Monday night, prime time. And with that said, I was super wrong about the Cowboys. But I'm going to put that aside. And as they go against your Washington football team, somehow I find myself in a position where I'm like, I'm going to take the Cowboys. Tell me why I'm crazy, Mr. Russell, as the Cowboys are in a pick'em game, 1-point favorites against Washington.
Well, I mean, listen, first of all, we do need to rehash that a little bit because we did talk pretty extensively about that Cowboys game going into it, right? And the handicap going in was twofold, right? One, that the offense was going to look as similar as it possibly could with Andy Dalton. It wasn't going to be that much of a step down. Unfortunately, it was exactly what we've seen from the Cowboys in that they still turned the ball over. And in this case, it wasn't Andy Dalton. I thought Andy Dalton was the best player on the field for the Cowboys. Now, that might not be saying all that much, admittedly, right? Because Zeke Elliott, is he a noted bowler by any chance? Because he was still rolling that ball down the field as though he was going for the 7-10 split. And so, when you're looking at that, you're like, okay, this game, it's 0-0 through the first quarter. And it's like neither of these offenses are very good at this point. And you go, maybe there's something we can get out of the Cowboys at some point. And like you said, right, what's your old coach's name? Coach Larynx? What was his name?
Coach Lilico.
Coach Lilico, right, wants to pound the rock. Well, if your guy just, I don't know if it's because he's wearing a cashmere sweater underneath his jersey or what, but the ball is loose all the time for Zeke Elliott at this point. And it's in his head, it's a full-on yip situation. And he's giving the Cardinals short fields. And all of a sudden, that game's 14-0, where, I don't know about you, but in that first half, it didn't look like the Cardinals were going to put a drive together at any point in time, right? Yeah. And so when you go, hey, just take a 30-yard drive. Let's make it easier on you. And how about we go down 14-0? And the one thing the Cardinals are really good at offensively is converting red zone opportunities. So you're really just playing right into their hands with those two fumbles. And now the
Totally.
game script is completely out of whack, right? It's no
Yep.
longer 0-0. It's 14-0. We got to really move the ball here. Obviously the Cardinals now can blitz the bleep out of Andy Dalton. They don't have to worry about the run game because Zeke
Yeah.
Elliott's on the sideline spinning his head like not really sure where he is because of all the fumbles, right? So
Yeah.
what's the concern with the run game at that point? There is none. So we're sending Budda Baker. We're sending Hassan Riddick. It's just complete chaos from a defensive standpoint. And of course, then things start to snowball. And now it's, okay, the difference between the Cowboys offense is when they go down 3 touchdowns, Dak Prescott isn't there to bring them back, right? The key
Fair.
is not getting down by 3 touchdowns. But if your star running back that you gave $100 million to is going to put down his soup spoon and grab a football and then just throw it to the other team, roll it on the ground, like you're done. No quarterback off the bench is going to be able to do that. Even a sort of professional, mid-level starter to top backup that Andy Dalton is, and nobody else on the team helps him, right? The offensive line is just letting guys go by. The wide receivers are dropping balls. They're not stepping up. So our handicap was, this is a team that's going to have to step up and rally around Andy Dalton. And we saw the opposite last week.
Opposite.
And now we see a bunch of, BS talk about the coaches and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so you go into this Washington game going like, should we expect them to rally now? Because I don't really see that, right? And so listen, this is a tough game to bet because the line opened 3 for the Cowboys and immediately like fired down to a pick 'em, right? So you just got to pick the winner. But who do you want in this game? Do you want the Cowboys with completely unable to protect anyone? They lost their best remaining, their last starter that they had left. They lost him in the first quarter of that game. They've lost their backup left tackle, had knee surgery this week. So they're on their 3rd left tackle, the most important position in the entire sport, and that includes quarterback. And now you're going up against Chase Young, basically the Alabama defensive line that Washington rolls out there every week, right? And it's like Andy Dalton's going to be running for his life in that game too, but it's a matter of, do you really want anything to do with the Washington football team either? It's a tough one. I would say like lean Washington, but it's not going to be one where I'm like pounding the table and like, we need to bet the football team. Not for me.
And I wonder too, how much my opinion would change based off of just that last play from the Washington football team last week, in which they went for 2 trying to win the game, and just how much that alters our perception of what happened last week. Because let's be honest, how many people really were sitting there watching that full game last week as opposed to just seeing, they lost and they were losing for most of the game but came back late. So it's interesting, right? I don't know. And it's an ugly game. Being forced to pick by myself, yes, I'm going to take the Cowboys still until, I change my mind on Saturday. But I look at the Washington team, and there's something I kind of want to touch on here a bit, right? And it was one of these quote-unquote controversies, which I'm doing in air quotes, and I'm bypassing the Cowboys' comments of them calling out their coach because that's just a whole dumpster fire on its own. And if you didn't realize from the opening press conference when Mike McCarthy acknowledged that he was lying to Jerry Jones, where he said that he watched every single play from the Cowboys season last year, and my guy admitted that he lied in the opening press conference. If you didn't know this was going to be a dumpster fire, that's on you. So we can kind of like shuffle aside from the Dallas Cowboys and go to this. And I'm saying it again, controversy with air quotes, because this whole going for 2 thing. And I know that people make it seem like this is an analytical thing more so than just like, to me, seems like common sense. And I think you might agree with me. But Washington was involved in one of these things last week where they scored a touchdown late and they go for 2 trying to get the win. What did you make of that play call, first off, from the Washington side? Because it kind of leads into where we're going with the next game as well. But for sure with Washington, that's totally the right play, right?
I didn't think so. And I'm the guy who's like, Yeah, and so here's the thing, right? Like this has been analytics week over at the window, and it wasn't
Okay.
planned, right? I
It
wasn't
just kind of
workshopping this
happened.
for weeks. It just kind of happened because it turns out that Romeo Crennel is one of the most advanced thinkers right now in analytic and sort of game scenario and all of that. So, win probability, win
Okay.
expectancy, all of that kind of thing. Who knew? The man's 74 years old and
Who
like looks
knew?
like he should be at a Denny's on a Sunday afternoon. And so, like, he ends up making the correct decision by going
Yeah.
for two because of the game that they were in, right? So we'll sort of
Yeah.
put that aside if you want to talk about that in a second. In the game that Washington was in, they were in a game against our boy Daniel Jones, where it's not a high scoring, high octane offense type of a game. His offense, Washington's, was not spectacular, right? New York took that 7-point lead on a fumble return for a touchdown on a previous drive where Washington was trying to win the game, right?
Yeah.
So when I'm looking at that, I'm going like, a lot of the times I'll be like, yes, go for two. Don't leave it up to a coin flip, right? Because the coin flip overtime in a game where high octane offenses are going back and forth, I don't want to leave it to that 50-50. I want to sort of control my own destiny, so to speak. In a 2-point conversion is around a 50% probability. That's just math. Like that's just the stats over the course of 20 years of whatever, right?
Yeah.
But when you're the Washington offense, you're on the sort of back end of that, right? Like you're on the you're the less likely than the 50, because the 50-50 is all offenses ever, right? That's including the Seahawks. That's including the Packers, right? Like Washington ain't that. So when you're looking at that, I go, no, kick it. Let's play overtime. If you lose the coin flip, okay, that might work out better because then you can stop the Giants and then all you need is like 20 yards and you can kick a field goal to win the game, right? Yeah. So it's like the bar is way, way lower in that game for success in overtime. Whereas over in Houston and Tennessee, it's like, let's just end this now because I'd rather Deshaun Watson have the ball to make a 2-point conversion than my defense on the field trying to stop Derrick Henry, who's going to have to make a 2-point conversion if we kick this extra point. So it's a game-by-game thing, and that's why the analytics sort of, people say analytics means you go for it all the time. It's like, no, it's you have to analyze the situation. And by the way, like if you have a 2-point conversion play where it's, and I use the example of the Philly special, not that was a 2-point conversion, but that was a play, right? A specialty play where it's like, this is what's going to happen. This is who we're throwing to. It's either going to work or it's not going to work. I much rather see those than be like, you know what? Let's just snap it back to Kyle Allen and let him do some magic, because there's no magic in Kyle Allen, right? Like, is he better than Dwayne Haskins? Probably, but there's no magic there. So they just drop it back. They hope for the best. And it went exactly as how you'd expect with Kyle Allen and the Washington football team.
So this is where we agree, right? Because to me, I think if you're telling me that I could put my offense in a position to where it's in a do or die scenario from inside the 5 to win the game, I'm going to take that every single time. Now, if my team is not capable of doing that, then we have bigger issues to begin with, to start off with, right? Which I know is just like obvious, right?
Know your personnel, know the strengths of your team, right? If you're a defensive
team, but
then you got to play to those strengths.
Yeah, but if we can't score, I understand totally what you're saying. All I'm countering with is if we can't figure out 3 plays, like we know these are our 3 plays that we run in this situation, that's an even bigger issue. And that's where we agree, right? Yeah. I'd much rather see them come out with some, I hate saying trick play, but some play where it's just like, hey, this is our go-to play where we're banking on getting this one guy wide open on some misdirection or whatever. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. Cool. That's where we totally agree. And I'm always going to, and maybe it's more of a mentality thing for me than an analytical thing, just in terms of, no, I always want to be confident enough to say we can score. I have these 2 plays that I can pick one of these 2 plays and we can get it done. As a Niners fan, I'm haunted by the fact that they were unable to win the Super Bowl, the Kaepernick Niners, unable to win the Super Bowl when it was 1st and goal from like the 5 and they couldn't score. That still, that pains me way more than last year's Super Bowl against with Jimmy G, right? Like that pains me way more. Like like Harbaugh, you don't have a play from the 5 and you have Frank Gore and Kaepernick, you can't do anything. So it's a mentality thing. With that said, where we do agree, the Texans game, right? You put that game away, you get the 2-point conversion. You're right, Deshaun Watson, you'd much rather have him running that play for sure. But they also knew, and this is maybe where you're more correct, and I'm wrong, the situation of not wanting their defense to be deciding the game against Derrick Henry, which is what leads us into the next game, which is a battle of 5-0 teams, right? Steelers and Titans. Derrick Henry, as mentioned, coming off. Now he has 3 games of at least 200 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns, which is tied for the most in NFL history with Jim Brown, LaDainian Tomlinson, and Barry Sanders. Not bad company at all.
No.
As I look at this, I have the Steelers, but this is an interesting game for me because you got Mike Vrabel out here doing the most. Right?
Yeah.
But
the trickster. I love him.
Right. So good. But
yeah,
it's basically another pick'em game. I'm on the Steelers just because I love, and this is going to be another public narrative, not analytical things backing it up, but I love the Steelers defense and Mike Tomlin just getting the Steelers defense motivated enough to try to embrace this challenge of slowing Derrick Henry. You're not going to stop Derrick Henry, but I just like the Steelers as one of those smash mouth type defenses, if we even have any of those things left in this modern NFL now in 2020.
Yeah, we don't.
But you know what I mean? No, but you know what I'm saying though, right? A team that's going to take the challenge of at least trying to slow Derrick Henry. What do you make of this game though? Titans, Steelers, 5-0 teams, Derrick Henry just beast moded.
Yeah, it's tough. Let's first and foremost, right? Like, obviously, Pittsburgh has looked a lot better than Tennessee has. And, the sort of public narrative, right, is Tennessee is the 5-0 version of the Bears, right? The fraudulent record. Whereas the Steelers, because they have Roethlisberger, they have this defense that you speak of. And it's like, yeah, all of that makes a ton of sense, right? But listen, remember the time when we used to have weddings? Remember we used to go to weddings, like group gatherings, right? Yeah. And you'd look up and there's the groom and then there's the best man right behind him. And then there's, all of the groomsmen or whatever. Right. Mm-hmm. Well, what happens if the groom just doesn't show up? Right. Well, the whole thing's canceled, presumably. Right. The best man doesn't just take the step over in his place. Right. The old Jerry Seinfeld bit about well, if he's the best man, why am I marrying him? And so you don't just take one step to the left and fill in.
Okay.
Unfortunately, football games don't get canceled just because your best player or, the guy that you want to spend the rest of your life with doesn't show up. And the problem is when you're talking about this sort of embrace, going up against Derrick Henry type thing, there's one player that's the key to the Steelers defense from a run game defense standpoint. And that gentleman had ACL surgery this week, right? Their middle linebacker, Devin Bush, right? He goes field side to field side, back and forth. He's the centerpiece of that entire defense, right? Sure, TJ Watt makes a bunch of plays, handful of other guys make plays, Minkah Fitzpatrick, all of that kind of thing, right? So when you go, okay, fundamentally what we have to do here is stop Derrick Henry. Oh, our middle linebacker is now out for the season. That is a major issue, right? So who's going to step in, right? The best man isn't there to step in. On Tennessee's side of things, this whole season, they've been playing without their best cornerback in Adoree Jackson, right? He is the groom of that defense, right? So when he steps out and they try to move the best man in and everybody takes a step to the left and all of a sudden the ring bearer is playing big minutes in, at backup cornerback, now their defense is going to be compromised, and that's been a situation for Tennessee, even in all of their wins. Well, he comes back. The groom, he was just in a cab. It broke down. He's in. Don't worry. The wedding is still on. He's coming down the aisle. He's back. Everybody gets to step back into their rightful place, and that's the situation for the Tennessee defense. Everybody takes that step over, right? The number 2 corner is no longer the number 1 corner. He can now just go be the number 2 corner. The guy who you don't really want on the field all that much, maybe, nickel situations, that kind of thing. He doesn't have to play all that much anymore. Same sort of thing with the guy who comes in to play nickel, who you never want on the field, right? So all of these guys move along. and the defense just improves. So you sort of have a two ships passing in the night thing, where Tennessee's defense is going to improve with the return of Jackson, and Pittsburgh's defense is going to falter with Bush being out. And you look at it from an offensive standpoint, listen, we're about 16 games into the Ryan Tannehill era, right? Like, we are finally there for 16 games. And his numbers over the course of a 16-game sample, a full season, if you will, are MVP caliber numbers. We're talking about over 4,000 yards. We're talking about like 30 touchdowns plus. We're talking about less than 10 interceptions, right? High quality stuff. But because it's spread over 2 seasons, and because his name's Ryan Tannehill, and he still has a little the Adam Gase stink on him, we're sort of still like not totally buying into the Tannehill, because we see Roethlisberger, who's been doing it for days, right? And we go, oh man, Pittsburgh offense. For me, Titans offense, I think, has more success on Sunday. And I think this is going to be like the Packers, where it's like, oh, Pittsburgh might be the best team in the league, right? As soon as that mantle kind of gets passed around, that's a problem, right? No one's saying Tennessee might be the best team in the league. They're not doing that, but they're saying that about the Steelers, and the injuries are starting to pile up, and we've seen the line move from Steelers -1.5 over to Tennessee being the favorite. And that's not like public money and just people all sort of deciding that Tennessee's the right side. That's some big money coming in based on this injury news that we've seen over this past week. So are we sort of spoiling it a little bit by maybe going sucker bet of the week here?
No, that's fair.
It's in the running.
That's fair. And this is perfectly why we do this podcast, right? To have these conversations in which we come in and we dispel a lot of these narratives in terms of, hey, this is the angle the public's looking at, and then bringing up things that really matter. As you mentioned, right? Middle linebackers is not something that a lot of people are picking up on their fantasy rosters. So that news, right, isn't going to be something that's on everyone's radar. But also, middle linebacker, unless you actually know football to understand how important that person is to the full-on operation of an NFL team, right? So this is why I love having these conversations with you, especially because you force us to be on top of some of those storylines that might go under the radar because the name recognition isn't as big as, oh, Derrick Henry's out, or, Ben Roethlisberger's out. So that part's perfect. And, the fact of the line swinging from one way to the next, that information is things that myself, as more the Joe Public football fan, might not be up on that game. So when you give me all these information and I sit there and I take all these things in, I'm looking more and more on the Titans, and as mentioned, a big reason why is how can I be in a position to go against your man's Mike Vrabel, who's out here just straight scamming the system, right? Like, for people who are unaware of what happened, basically he sent out an extra player on defense onto the field on purpose to take a too many men on the field penalty, then faked being mad about it and upset that his team took said penalty, again, where he was the one that sent the dude out there, all just so that he could stop the clock, save his team about an extra 40 seconds so they could have enough time to tie the game and eventually end up winning it in OT. When you are pulling the strings from that level, I mean, that's more than the Mike Tomlin rah-rah speech that I was alluding to earlier on, right? That's a different game of chess. So I like that. This is why we talk things through. Start out at one point, poke holes in the narrative, come out the other end with a different viewpoint. Titans, I like it. I like what you're saying. I will say that you convinced me. And if we are calling this a sucker bet of the week, I'm forcing myself to just blindly listen to whatever the sucker bet of the week is this week. Just because I've been going against the sucker bet the past few weeks, making me the biggest sucker of them all. I'm just saying.
Well, don't be too hard on yourself, but at least, like you said, we're having the conversation. And maybe by the time you find a name for this podcast, you'll fully embrace the sucker bet of the week. And it is worth mentioning, because you talked about the importance of middle linebackers. It's almost like Mike Vrabel played middle linebacker for Bill Belichick for 10 years or so, right? Like, that's a Belichickian move, right? This isn't all that complicated. And we sort of talk about, like, why aren't more teams better at this? And it's like, I don't know why. And it's like, it's not, we're not doing secrets out here, right? Like Vrabel has taken his stuff from Belichick, gaming the system, if you will. So it's like, can't we all just do that? And for some reason, we can't. I don't know why.
Someone who was also, I guess, under Bill Belichick, but doesn't really have the same Belichickian type luck, we'll say.
Okay.
Your man's Romeo Crennel. Now, the Texans got a win last week, right? But Texans are now find themselves as 3.5-point dogs hosting Aaron Rodgers and the Packers. We mentioned the sucker bet of the week. You tried to warn me last week about the Packers, and I did not listen. And well, we'll get into the Tampa Bay talk soon. But what do you make of this game and this line? Because simply, I really just like the Packers here at 3.5-point favorites. I don't really like the extra half point, but I also really don't like Romeo Crennel. So I'm sitting here on the Packers and the Texans. Deshaun Watson, that might have been the best Deshaun Watson and the offense type game that we've seen so far last week, but still ended up in an L because their defense isn't really good. Aaron Rodgers didn't look good last week at all, as you did try to warn us. So maybe looking for a bounce back this week. Maybe, hopefully.
He definitely is, right? Yeah, he definitely is. And listen, I've said sort of all week that it's very easy to sort of be on the Packers and just kind of roll with that, right? But obviously there's some defensive concerns with the Packers. And if the Texans are moving the ball, right? This is an offense that in theory has enough talent that they should be able to do so. So this is one that I think is going to be a bit of a track meet, right? You're going to get a ton of points from the Packers. Like, we know that obviously Tampa Bay defense, not the same thing as the, atrocious Texans defense.
A change in weight class, as you say.
Absolutely. Why are all these plays working all of a sudden? It's like, because you're playing different players and a different scheme. And so, are Green Bay going to score a ton of points here? For sure. But when we're looking at this, and it's not quite sucker bet level, and maybe it is because I'm still probably going to be on the Packers, which would then make me the sucker in this case. But it's going to be so back and forth, I think, that like a plus 3.5, listen, if it's a high scoring game, I always kind of say like take the points because there's going to be a lot of them and you're going to get into sort of 2-point conversion type territory. And, the back door will always be open and all of that kind of jargon, right? That we spew quite regularly here. And so I'm not going to tell you not to take the Packers, and I'm not going to tell you that it's the sucker bet of the week. I am going to say, like, I don't love it as much as maybe I would have loved it when I was watching Green Bay last week and going like, oh, they're going to be coming back hard next week. Like, they're going to get a lot, it's going to look a lot easier next week. There's some injury concerns there as well, offensive line, all of that kind of stuff. And you do obviously have to be a little bit, concerned about the 1 or 2 game-breaking plays from J.J. Watt, right? Like, he's still good enough that he can make a play or 2 in the game. So it's not something I'm running to be like, this is a lock. Yeah. But I do understand how you could really, really like the Packers in this one. Let's just be a little bit careful out there.
I like it. And if we're talking sucker bet of the week, for people who might be new to the pod, the whole premise behind the sucker bet of the week, ideally, is just something that when the entire public narrative is, oh, this is an easy game, pump the brakes a little. That's basically what the sucker bet of the week is. Take a second, take a step back. Make sure that you're okay with what you're doing. That's kind of it. And as mentioned last week, no, sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, and it helps that these sucker bets are often primetime games, featured games, right? Like the Fox game of the week for Tampa Bay Green Bay last week, where everybody's watching it, everybody's got an opinion, right? So when it's buried in 1 o'clock type zone, you go, you know what? If the Packers win this game by 20 points, like, is that going to break the sports book? Not really, because there's 8 other games going on that the public's probably going to lose a fair amount on, right? Whereas like if it's a Sunday night game and everybody's headed one way and everything that's happened that day is going to that Sunday game, right? All of the parlays, right? Your pro line ticket. And again, we say don't bet pro line, but like if you still do and you're putting that Sunday game in your pro line ticket, just know, right? Like that line is going to be tweaked because they know that all they need is that Sunday night loss, and it clears a lot of the stuff off the books. That's not necessarily the case for a 1 o'clock game. So we're sort of less likely to put the sucker bet of the week on a 1 o'clock game, given that it gets buried with a bunch of the rest of the games.
Exactly. I got you, my dude. I got you. And we mentioned last week, you're all over Tampa Bay, Tom Brady, and most importantly, their defense and their ability of what they did against Aaron Rodgers last week. And that was our sucker bet of the week last week. Now, this also ties into another thing we do on this pod, which is our Brady versus Belichick watch, which we got to give it to Tampa Bay in a big way. And if we start off with the Bucs this week, they are 3.5-point favorites in Las Vegas. I caught myself there. I was about to say Oakland.
Do it all the time.
It happens. It happens, right? So 3.5-point favorites, Tampa Bay in Las Vegas. And if the Bucs defense was a problem, and I know exactly what you're gonna say after I say this, so I'm gonna play this out. I'm gonna play this out.
Play it out.
But if the Bucs defense was such a problem for Aaron Rodgers, I don't see how Derek Carr is gonna be sitting here being like, "All right, I'll figure it out." And I know that it's not just Derek Carr. He has Josh Jacobs, who is a beast, and they're coming off a bye, and you might be able to cook up some things. They sat at home and watched it, but I just want to know that I'm gonna trust Tampa Bay's defense to make things spicy, as a saying I like to say all the time. Maybe I should make that as a t-shirt. Just make it spicy, right? Against Derek Carr and that offense, and just be in his face. Just make life difficult. Just give me the couple shots going to break of Ndamukong Suh talking shit to Derek Carr like we saw last week, him and Aaron Rodgers going back and forth. But I like the Bucs. I'll take the 3.5 points. What do you think of this game here with the Raiders coming off a bye?
Well, and the big news, right, is that the Raiders' entire offensive line is in COVID protocol, right? So probably a bad thing if you're talking. And so the game's kind of up in the air as well, right? Because you go, allegedly the COVID protocol would say that you can't even play until Monday. And so I don't even really know if this game,
hold on. Not to make too many jokes about it, but maybe they've contacted Nick Saban and figured out what the proper procedure is to get over COVID in due time.
Thrown a couple bucks at the team doctors to make a negative test or two. Yeah, Trent Brown comes down. He's on the COVID list, right? Not that he has it necessarily, but that he's been in contact with somebody who does. And then, of course, the rest of the offensive line is like, well, we've been in contact with him, obviously, over the course of the week of practice. And so now they, as an entire unit, have to at least sit out practice. Now, this is a team that's going up against the Buccaneers, whose defense, from a run game defense standpoint, is the best in the league. And so, obviously that's kind of like part 1, 2, and maybe 3 of the Raiders' offensive game plan, right? It's hitch in the mouth with Josh Jacobs and then try to hit you deep with Henry Ruggs. And so if they're just going to stop Josh Jacobs because A, they're just good in general, and B, because maybe some of these guys, maybe it's just Trent Brown, have to miss this game. So everything's up in the air. Obviously, this sort of feels like it's, that's Sunday night, right? We just talked about it. Yep. It does sort of feel sucker bet, adjacent here, but there's just so much going on that I can't tell you to take Las Vegas here or that this is the sucker bet of the week.
There's so much that could change between now and then.
There's so much that could change, and the offensive line's not even practicing together, right? Yeah. And so, there's just not that much we can really go with here.
That's one for sure where it's stay tuned for sure. Check the ticker for the latest, as we would say back in the day at the Score, to find out what's going on leading up to game time with this number, because you're right. That's the O-line, again, not necessarily the names that are going to come across your pickup or drop list on your fantasy team, but something that is massively important to the entire football operation. So more on that, but we'll use this time to shift to the Patriots, the other side of the Belichick versus Brady matchup. And as things did not go well for Bill Belichick, as they were dealing with their own COVID issues last week, or coming off of said COVID issues. And the Pats now enter week 7 below 500 after 5 games for the first time since 2002, which is Tom Brady's first full season as a starter, which has your man's Cam Newton saying things like, quote, "I don't point fingers, I point thumbs." Close quote.
I like it.
That's a bar right there. That's a bar from
Yeah.
Cam. But the
That might be the
Patriots,
name of the podcast at this point.
I don't. Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of this going on here. Don't listen to this guy's picks. I don't know. Right. But the Patriots are hosting my San Francisco 49ers, and the Patriots are favored by 2 points. This line seems weird. I don't like this game, and this is one where I'm begging for some assistance here, because the reason I don't like this game is I think I have a good feel on both of these teams, and I don't like when they're going against each other.
Right.
Right? So here's the thing. I know what the Niners do. They run the ball, run the ball, run the ball. As I tell you all the time, I'm not fooled by what Jimmy Garoppolo's numbers look like, because I actually watched the game and know that his 268 yards and 3 touchdowns, it's shovel passes and yards after the catch. So I'm not fooled by that. I know they just pound the rock, run the ball, run the ball, run the ball. But I also know that Bill Belichick, schematically, his goal, I'm going to try to take away what you do well. So how do those two things meet up in this game in terms of the Niners getting 2 points in New England?
Right. And so, listen, I was never like a journal guy when I was a kid, right? Like I wasn't like writing into the journal, right?
Where is this going? Okay.
I think with the NFL, sometimes we need to do a little Dear Diary, right?
Okay.
And so if we go into our virtual Dear Diary, let's start talking about like the narratives that have gone throughout this season, right?
Yep.
So Dear Diary, the rest of the league is complete idiots for not signing Cam Newton, right? Like that was like week 3, week 4, like, and to point where we're all embarrassed. I don't even like run a team, and I was like, I'm embarrassed. I'm sorry. Like I should have signed him, right? Like that was the guilt that we were all getting as a society because we didn't believe in the greatness of Cam Newton, right? He gets COVID. They miss, he misses the Kansas City game. They push the week, game back a week, and now it's like, okay, he has a really rough game, and let's not kid ourselves. It was a really rough game against the Denver Broncos after not really being able to practice for a couple of weeks, and now I'm hearing like on different sort of radio shows and programs, it's like, well, they can't bring him back next year. Like the Patriots are in the market for a quarterback. And like, it's just like totally selling my guy down the river. And I was like, well, can I no longer be guilty then because I didn't sign him to quarterback my team? Like,
well, hold on.
Probably still pretty good.
The thing to me that also makes this narrative swing so hilarious is the dude had COVID.
Yeah.
Right?
We talked about it on our podcast. And like Dr. Fauci hasn't gotten to the point in his study to find out what are the effects of COVID on starting quarterbacks the next week. It's going to be a while before he gets to that. And we get some sort of public announcement on that type of thing. Right. So yeah, like he had COVID. I don't really know, whatever. Other thing, right? Remember last week, it was like the week was all of these teams that had no chance to win last week.
Yes.
Then they won, and now they have no chance to lose, right? And vice versa, right? Like the Bucs had no chance to lose against the Bears. Now they have no chance to win against the Packers, and of course they do, right? Yeah. Well, guess what, right? We've got that situation happening twofold in this one, right? Sunday Night Football, the world on the Rams. There's no way the 49ers can win this game.
Not us.
Not us, but like, that was the narrative, right? And now they go on the road to the Patriots, and it's like the line has crashed from 5.5 before last week down through 3, down to 2. Everybody all about the 49ers. And it's like, there's no way the Patriots can win a week after they were 9-point favorites at one point against another NFL football team. Like, I don't even care who it is as long as it's not the Jets. But like anybody else, like at 9.5, and now to be just 2-point favorites and have that adjustment seems like a bit of an over an adjustment, right? And so from a football standpoint, like you said, 49ers do what they do. They run the football. And as much as we go, okay, like running backs don't matter all that much, and there's a decent chance Jerick McKinnon fills in nicely, as well as this Hasty fellow, I think is his name, that all of a sudden like showed up off of the kickoff coverage team and was taking carries last week. Like, sure, in theory, he might replace, Raheem Mostert, but like Mostert, oh man, like that guy flies, right? You don't want anything to do with that guy in the open field. And so it's simply put, is New England's going to do what New England does. And what is that? They take away the thing that you do best or the player that you rely on most. And as much as that, like in theory, is the run game, That's actually George Kittle, right? On 4th and 2, who do you go to? George Kittle. You don't think they're going to put their best guy, 2 guys, however they want to do it, on George Kittle all the time. They're never going to let George Kittle beat them. If you are a prop better, if you ever sort of were interested in betting props, Kittle under is going to be a play this week, because just it is every week when you're talking about the Patriots. Now, are we worried about the Patriots offense? A little bit, but were we all that worried about it when they were racking up points against Seattle? You know, it looked pretty good back then, right? And they're going to do what they do, and it's not necessarily explosive, but it isn't the train wreck that it was against Denver last week. I think that was just based a ton on lack of preparation. And so, you know, we can get into the narrative, you know, Dear Diary again about like Bill Belichick and coming back off of losses and all of that kind of thing. And people cite the 2-3 record, but like 1 yard away from beating Seattle, which would make them 3-2, and a Brian Hoyer complete fiasco against the Chiefs for them, almost beating the Chiefs in that Monday night game with basically like a hobo off the street as their quarterback. And it's like, man, like, okay, teams lose, teams get upset. It happens all the time. It's the NFL, but it's not time to just Dear Diary, Cam Newton can't play in this league and we were all right for passing on him. That's not the case. I think Cam Newton has a big bounce back game here. The 49ers, you know, are forced to throw it, and you know what happens in that situation, right? Jimmy G,
I'm
reliance. And that's very scary. I'm going the opposite way as most people, as most sort of sharp people as well. I like the Patriots in this game a lot.
Yeah, and you know what the thing is too? There's a couple things that you just said that I want to double down on. I'm not overreacting to what happened last week with the Patriots at all, just because, as mentioned, Cam Newton coming off of COVID. We don't know what that means. We don't know how severe it was. We don't know anything about that, but we do know that bare minimum, it meant that he didn't practice all week. You might need your quarterback to practice after being off for a full week before that as well. That might be something that's kind of important, right? So I'm not going to overreact to that. There was a number floating around about Tom Brady coming off of a loss in the same season, right? That number is Tom Brady's record being 48-13, which is a 787 win percentage. Obviously, we know most of that would be also a Bill Belichick number as well, right? So when you look at those two things, and Raheem Mostert is super important. And I know that his name started to blow up a bit last year, especially with that massive game he had against the Packers in the playoffs. But the Niners offense just goes different levels when he's in there, because he perfectly is able to run that, the spread offense, or the spread running game, the zone running game that Shanahan loves so much. He accelerates at that because he's so fast, but also he's not afraid of the contact if the contact does come. So the running game's not going to be what we think it is. You mentioned removing Kittle. If you are one of those prop people, that would mean Debo. Take Debo. If you are one of those prop people, look for Debo Samuel this week. But I will close out this section and say I will probably end up on the Patriots, if not for another Cam Newton line or bar, as the kids say, from last week, in which Cam Newton said, quote, "The sky might be falling, but listen, I'll bring my umbrella, my raincoat to get the job done." Close quote.
Okay. And that raincoat's probably going to have some like peacock feathers on it.
Oh, for sure.
It's going to be elaborate.
You know that umbrella and raincoat is matching for sure. But we'll go from Cam's current team to Cam's former team, which is the Panthers, who did not get the job done last week. And you did tell us they would be in tough against the Bears. Again, the narrative of Teddy Two Gloves and going up in weight class in terms of going against a different weight class in defense and defensive line. I think we saw some limitations last week, but still, I feel like we have a good read on these things, which is where I want to be. But they're in New Orleans as 7.5-point underdogs. This seems really strange to me, as that seems like a lot of points. I absolutely love the points here because, quite simply, I don't see there being a 7.5-point difference between these two teams. Am I way off here, or am I missing something about the Saints?
I don't think you are, and I just feel like the Saints all season have been just a touch overvalued, right? Like you're always kind of getting, whether it was against the Packers where it was like the line probably should have been about 3 and it was sort of 3.5 a little more often, right? Like the line being higher than a touchdown even against the Chargers on that Monday night game a couple of weeks ago, where it's like, we probably could have gotten away with it being 7, 6.5, but like for whatever reason, the market still believes in the Saints, right? And I still think they're a pretty good team here, but I've got, I'm busting out the actual legitimate numbers here at this point. Okay. Teddy Bridgewater, the cover king, okay, 30-10 overall. How's that? 13-3 following a loss. How's that? 18-4 as an underdog. 18-4 as an underdog. 16-3 ATS on the road. 14-2 as a road underdog. This is Teddy Bridgewater's zone right here. Now, I don't know that they win this game, but I will be making a bet on their money line. It's the first bet that I made. It might actually be the only bet in the NFL that I've made at this point. Plus 7.5 for me was a take. I don't know what the deal is with Michael Thomas, right? Talked about it last week. Like, is he going to punch somebody in the face again? Is his ankle now his hamstrings kicking up? And I don't know what the deal is with all of that. The one thing that I have some concern about is, we talked about the lack of preseason, right? And how these teams need 4 games one way or another. And it may not even be 4 games. It might just be 4 weeks of playing games and then reacting to those games. And so what we've seen is a lot of these teams off of their bye week come back with different stuff, whether it was the Steelers unveiling Chase Claypool or the Lions completely changing their defense last week. They also went away from Adrian Peterson and more to DeAndre Swift, right? Like these teams are making some small adjustments. Now, are the Saints going to make a small adjustment off of their bye week, whether it's defensively, whether it's offensively, right? Maybe Taysom Hill is gone. Maybe Taysom Hill is going to play 20 snaps a game, right? Like who knows, right? We just don't know. But if the Saints defense improves, then that might, go to everyone, the market sort of overvaluing them, right? That might sort of give credence to that. And we might be looking at the Saints team that this market has expected all along. So still a little bit, scared, so to speak, about that. But listen, Teddy Two Gloves as an underdog, against his former team. So a little bit concerned about that too, right? Did they know more about Teddy than we do, right? So Joe Brady, their offensive coordinator for Carolina, formerly of the Saints when Teddy Bridgewater was there. That's why that offense is working the way it's working in Carolina. But the Saints should know that offense. So there is some concern. Don't go nuts necessarily, but I think there's some value, ton of value on plus 7.5 and some value on the money line. And it's one of the reasons that we're going with the Eagles in Survivor and not the Saints this week, because the Saints would be sort of that second, one of the other popular options. Let's just put it that way.
I like it. I like it a lot. And last week, as mentioned, the Panthers lost to the Bears. The Bears defensive line now gets to feast on Jared Goff and the Rams, who somehow are 6-point favorites. And I don't understand really how. And, kind of like what I just said about the Panthers and the Saints game, I don't really understand how I look at this game and I say the Rams are 6-point favorites against the Bears. So I'm on the Bears in the 6 points. And, hey, Khalil Mack, meet Jared Goff meet Khalil Mack. That's kind of my thought process looking at this game.
Yeah, and this game was played last year, right? And it was actually been played the last couple of years. So, sometimes with these divisional matchups, you might not see them for 3 or 4 years. And we've actually seen them last 2 years. So the first one was in Chicago. A lot of people remember it because Jared Goff looked terrible, like he never had been in cold weather before, and it was a complete mess. And then last year, it was a close one. I remember having the Bears plus the points, feeling really good about it, and then just watching the Bears miss 2 field goals and then watch Trubisky miss wide open receivers for deep plays that would have sealed the cover, and then watch the Rams literally drive it down the last 4 minutes. And, they could have knelt. It was sort of one of those deals. And they're like, let's just bury this into the end zone. And they end up covering the spread. Well, I think the Bears remember that, right? And so they know that if they had a little bit better quarterbacking play, they had a little bit of better kicking, they would have won that game outright. And so you mentioned Khalil Mack, and obviously he's sort of feels like he's healthy where he wasn't last year as much, and he's really dominating. And that defense in general, right? Turning Carolina over at the right time. They probably shouldn't have even given up a touchdown, right? There was an atrocious pass interference, like 40-yard penalty that left Carolina on the one that allowed them to punch in their only touchdown of the game. And so this defense is cooking along. And the player to watch for on Monday night is Akeem Hicks, right? Like, this is a guy who is dominating the middle of the defense for the Chicago Bears. He's the guy who's kind of making all of these other guys work for his purposes, right? Like, he's stopping the defense or stopping the run defensively, and he's allowing Khalil Mack to get like loose on that edge and be able to track down the quarterback here. So when Jared Goff is pressured, right, like that's when he freaks out, when he's off his spot. And I don't see any reason why he wouldn't be in this case. I like the Bears in this one too. Money line's a little tricky because, again, you're sitting there going logistically, you're like, they're 6-1 now? Like, how did we get here? But as this number sort of creeps up, and who knows where it ends up on Monday, right? We're at 6 now from 5.5. Could it get to 6.5? That would be great. I don't see it getting to 7, but we might be able to get some rogue 6.5s where we're, covered if it goes to overtime, right? As soon as it goes to overtime, if we got plus 6.5, we're winners.
We're laughing. So the Rams the aforementioned Rams, pardon me, at 4-2 trail the 5-0 Seahawks in the NFC West. Russell Wilson and company are now in Arizona as 3.5-point favorites. I didn't like how the Cards looked on Monday night. I thought,
right.
Kyler Murray, there were some plays where, that huge bomb he had to Kirk really inflated some numbers, made things look a lot better. Obviously, Zeke's fumbles made things look a whole lot better, and kind of masked like the fact that Arizona's offense didn't look that good at all. So now you're coming off that and going against Russ, whose offense isn't going to look like Andy Dalton and Zeke's Cowboys, right? I like Seattle here.
Yeah, it's like the worst 28-point victory in the history of time, right? Like for the Cardinals, you're like, what did we see here? Because we talked about the 2 fumbles leading to short fields. We didn't even get to the 80-yard touchdown where like Leighton Vander Esch literally turns to the corner that's covering Christian Kirk and is like making hand signals that I presume are like, don't get beat down the field, like they're going to run a go route on you. And then he's like, what? And it's boom, like 80 to the house. And so it's like, I don't see any of those necessarily happening. Now, from an injury standpoint, are the Seahawks going to get Vernon Adams back, right? Remember the first 2 weeks where you and I were like, that guy's all over the field.
Jamal Adams.
Yes, thank you. Of course. Jamal Adams. And so, so we're like, oh my God, this guy's all over the field. He's incredible, blah, blah, blah. And then he misses a couple of games, and not surprisingly, right? Like it gets really dicey defensively for the Seahawks, even worse than it kind of was even when Adams was in the mix. And so is he coming back? Didn't practice on Wednesday. We sit here Thursday, kind of a big day for practice, obviously Friday, the most important. And so, like, does the 38-10 win or whatever it was, I think that was the score, but like, does that sort of influence people to think that the Cardinals are better than they are? And are the things that the Cardinals did against the Cowboys going to work for them against the Seahawks? And I mean like blitzing hand over fist, because that's the only way to generate pressure since Chandler Jones is out, right? Like that was part of our handicap too. Like Chandler Jones is out. How are they going to get pressure? Well, they decided, you know what? We're just going to blitz constantly from all angles. And is that going to work against Russ?
No.
I kind of doubt it, right? Like he will beat them deep in a way that Andy Dalton like just can't, right? And so again, this feels a lot like the Green Bay Houston one, right? In that it's a road, favorite, 3.5 points. The sharp people are going to kind of tell you like, this is a sucker bet, like take the underdog, et cetera, et cetera. And while like, I agree with that to an extent with the Green Bay Houston one, I just think this is one that in the past, Seattle goes to Arizona and just absolutely trounces them. It's been the one sort of thing. And I love betting Arizona at home. I have been doing it for decades at this point. But this is always the one where you do it and then like it's 38-14, and you're just like, man, like I really stepped in one in that case. So for me, I
Are
like
there
to see
fans in Arizona?
I believe some, yeah,
Some, but
and it's been
not.
a couple
Okay.
of weeks since they've been there, so yeah, like
Okay.
we might see a little bit more, but yeah, like that offense just doesn't look as good as it's sort of
Yeah.
making people think it is, right?
I got you. And so, yeah, we both appear to be leaning on the Seahawks in that one for sure. From Russell Wilson to another star QB in Pat Mahomes. And we saw a different Pat Mahomes on Monday night versus the Bills as the Chiefs ran the ball, and then ran it some more. In fact, they ran it 46 times, which was tied for the
Yeah.
most ever by an Andy Reid coach team. Not sure if we see that same formula in week 7 against the Broncos, but I like KC. Am I going to get burned again by going against your man's Drew Luck and the
Yeah.
Broncos, who you keep warning me they're spicy when Drew Luck is in, right? You keep trying to warn me, but I'm leaning Chiefs while it's still under 10 points.
Yeah, and I think that's probably sort of fundamentally the right move here. And normally I would say, like, let's just wait. We'll probably get 10 and a half. We can take the Denver Broncos. But there's one sort of underlying thing here. And listen, we're in Toronto right now. Like, it's what, 10 degrees Celsius out here.
Yeah.
Like, we're not worried about snow just yet.
No.
Well, you know where there's going to be snow this weekend? Denver, Colorado.
Hey.
And we are looking at our first potential. And listen, I'm not a weatherman. I'm just reading what they're telling me, right? And so we could be looking at a snow game. And you go, oh, snow game, maybe lower scoring. Like maybe Denver can hang in because it's, the snow is going to jam up the Kansas City offense, all of that kind of thing, right? And so coming into the season where, a few people were sort of talking, pretty highly of Denver. They could surprise, they could make the playoffs. One of the main stats was Drew Lock was 4-1 as a starter last year, right? At the end of the season. What was the one game? The one game was against the Chiefs, and it wasn't just against the Chiefs. It was against the Chiefs in a snow game where Drew Lock was basically huddling in the corner, completely shivering as though he was Jared Goff playing Chicago in a November evening. And so if you were thinking like Denver might be live here, I just can't get that out of my head because Patrick Mahomes is running around. He was looking like it was recess in grade 3 where he's out there throwing it around, having the time of his life. And Drew Lock was the kid going like, I don't like being cold. And so there's a very real possibility you show up to this game and there's 3 inches of snow and it's all happening out there. And Drew Lock is like, this isn't for me. And Patrick Mahomes is like, I got defense on skates right now. Like I'm making all kinds of plays out here. That's terrifying. In general, I'm probably staying away, but I don't think you could go wrong with Kansas City -9.5.
I love it. The next game is Falcons and Lions, right? The Falcons are 2.5-point favorites at home to the Lions. And I could be wrong here, but to me, I'm going to call this a Spider-Man meme for me in my viewpoint of these two teams because I don't have a good read on either of these two teams, right?
Yeah.
That's why. Like in my brain as I see it, I'm just kind of like, I don't know what's really going on. But I'm leaning Falcons because at least for 1 week, they stuck to a game plan of feeding Julio Jones. And I know that the numbers of 137 yards and 2 touchdowns is what's getting the headlines. But what was most important to me was the fact that he had 10 targets as opposed to just 4 targets in each of the previous 2 weeks. I just like seeing that trend. I just hope that trend continues. Yeah. But I don't really know. You mentioned Detroit's defense earlier on. Yeah. Should they make me more worried and think more about taking Detroit as the dogs?
I think so, actually. Yeah. I mean, I was high on Detroit coming into this season, right? And I might have been literally high when I had that take, right? Like it's possible. But this is a team, that came off their bye. And you sort of say Spider-Man meme, and I completely get that. They sort of Spider-Man themselves against me as they were the 2 games that I bet live, just assuming that those teams taking an early lead, Detroit against Jacksonville, Atlanta against Minnesota, were going to blow it or at least sort of find themselves in a close game late. And that just never happened for either team. Yeah. Now, Atlanta, right, you've got this whole Dan Quinn is gone. they get the dead coach bounce, right? That we saw from Houston before that. And we were sort of wondering if that was going to be the case. And it sure looked like it was the case against Minnesota. Helped that Kirk Cousins got into Kirk Cousins throw a bunch of interceptions mode, right? Like that was pretty helpful in that case. And so does that carry on from week to week? I don't know that that does, right? Because there hasn't been anything sort of structurally that they've changed. It was really just like, we're going to do what we do, and hopefully we catch a few breaks here. And maybe we're playing a little bit harder, maybe, because Julio's back, we've got more of our, offensive options, all of that kind of stuff. With Detroit, like you can see discernible change in what they've been doing. I mean, again, I guess it was the Jags, so in a way it was sort of like a scrimmage in a way, right? Like a glorified practice at this point.
Yeah.
But they were still like, all right, like DeAndre Swift, who like couldn't really get off the bench. Now he's getting 15, 18 carries and he's breaking off big runs, all of that kind of stuff, right? We've got a fully healthy Kenny Golladay, for my money, one of the top 5 receivers in the league, probably the most underrated from sort of a name standpoint, in part because he's having trouble staying healthy, but he seems healthy now. And then this, like we said, this defense, right? Which was literally just playing the exact same system over and over and over again, and that's why they were getting shredded, right? We talk all the time. It's no longer a league where if you have one dominant defensive player or whatever, that they are going to dominate things. It's scheme, and if you're going to play the same coverage every time, teams are going to exploit that. Well, the Lions, hopefully, I think, self-scouted, and they're like, we should really mix it up here a little bit. And after a bye week, they did that, and it worked against the Jags. Is it going to work in the same way against the Falcons? Well, maybe not in the same way, but if you're going to give me a couple of points with Detroit, it's a team that I like to win this week. And I just think they're a better team, and I just think there's more impetus for them having success going forward than there is for the Falcons.
I gotcha. I was even reading some about other GMs or front offices around the league kind of wondering if Matt Ryan or Julio Jones could be available at the trade deadline, which kind of just seems like it wasn't saying that they think they will be, but just the fact that it was even a conversation just points further to your fact, right? In terms of if we're talking about where we think these two teams are going. Yeah. Makes sense, my dude. And again,
it's time to blow it up in Atlanta, right? So, and that's that, right? So I don't know that those two guys get traded. That doesn't really seem like a thing that happens in the NFL, right? Like maybe Julio, you could make the case there, but like a starting quarterback, even just going to a new team doesn't really happen, right?
Exactly. But yeah, more so, I just want to point out the fact too, again, another perfect example of we bring up the line, we bring up what the narratives are, poke holes through them, come out the other end with a different feeling, or at least I have a different feeling on said pick. Now, last week's pod and this week's pod, we talked a lot about weight classes, and you were right last week. We were fading Baker and the Browns as they were stepping up in weight class going against the Pittsburgh defense, right? And this week, they're taking on Cincy, and they're 3-point favorites against the Bengals. The Bengals are not the Steelers. No. And am I wrong if I'm not really minding that Baker is hurt and it could be Case Keenum? We could be seeing some Case Keenum. I'm only half joking, by the way.
No, I don't think
I'm not. I'm not swayed that much by this news against the Bengals in this week.
No, and it's funny, right? Like it's that standard like quarterback, the Andy Dalton type guy that like doesn't inspire anyone to get excited about them, right? Like they just look super generic, and that's the case with Case. And so that being said, right, like this is a guy who led that team in Minnesota to a NFC championship game, I believe, right? You had the Minnesota Miracle, like he was in charge of that whole deal. And then of course, even Minnesota was like, yeah, but like, you're not it. And so they went and got Kirk Cousins. Now, are they regretting that to this day? Who knows, right? Like that's neither here nor there. The thing is, though, that team offensively was run by Kevin Stefanski as their offensive coordinator, right? So we talked maybe sort of foolishly in a way about Ron Rivera bringing in Kyle Allen as a backup quarterback because of his familiarity, right? Same sort of deal here where you've got Kevin Stefanski bringing in Case Keenum, a guy who he's had success with. Now, obviously, he's not going to just give him the starting job over Baker Mayfield. There's way more invested in Baker Mayfield than there is in Case Keenum. But like you said, it's a guy who knows the offense and knows what they want to do. And what they want to do is they want to run the football. And that was a problem against a Steelers team that got out to an early lead against them, right? And so we we talked about Mayfield being banged up, OBJ like missing a lot of practice time, right? Sort of similar to Cam Newton, right? If you don't practice, you're probably not going to play all that great potentially in the week ahead. Talked about the offensive line having some injury issues, and those aren't necessarily going away, but they're way bigger of a problem against the Pittsburgh Steelers than they are against the Cincinnati Bengals, right? And so a lot of people sort of see the Bengals in that game last week probably should have beat the Colts, right? Let's just be honest.
Definitely should.
You probably should have beat the Colts. If you have 4th and 1 when you're down 1 point on the 40-yard line, you should probably just go for it on 4th and 1 instead of trying a kick with Randy Bullock, right? Like that's just never going to work. And so, you see that and you go, okay, the Cincinnati team might have it going, like they can move the ball a little bit on offense. And that's not untrue, but they still can't stop anybody defensively, and they can't, and Cleveland is going to have a ton of success on the ground. And we saw that a month ago, right? This was the game, that Thursday night game that I'm still not necessarily over. But the point is they out yards per played them by 3+ yards per play. And remember, it was, Mayfield threw the interception and we were all like, you're running for 10 yards a carry. Why are you even trying to throw the ball? And I don't think anything's changed from that specific standpoint, right? Like maybe Joe Burrow is a little bit better. Maybe even the Cincinnati defense as a whole is a little bit better. But I think just from a road grading offensive standpoint, the Browns are going to rely on that a ton. And it doesn't matter that Nick Chubb is not in this game, right? It's Hunt, Johnson, all the way down the line here, right? They can run the football, and I think they do. And I think this is one where we talked about it last week. This is a spot to fade the Browns, but we're not going to give up on them. We're going to fade, hope to cash, and then that's going to create value and a lower number the next week. Because if they beat the Steelers last week, what's this number this week? 6? Something along those lines, right? So we're getting the lowest possible number that we can get here on a Browns team that people aren't clamoring to bet on the same way that they are with Green Bay on the road or Seattle on the road, right? It's just not the same thing. So give me Cleveland here, -3, right? Make sure you get the 3, even if you have to pay a little extra, but -3, -115 is the bet in this one.
I like it for sure. And one big thing that's super important to me watching Baker Mayfield last week to this week, and we talked about the difference between the defenses you're facing. Baker last week was pressured on 52% of his dropbacks. That's insane. That's a lot. And we know, and we talked about it, happy feet Baker, when he's moving around in the pocket like that, that's not the Baker that is meant for success, especially in Stefanski's offense. So we don't expect to really see that against the Bengals, so I feel a lot more comfortable taking the Browns this week for sure. Now, it's taken us a while to get to the Buffalo Bills in this pod, and maybe it's because of the level of disappointment that Bills Mafia has with Josh Allen and company because my dude was in the MVP conversation. Bills Mafia is walking around with their chests out, talking about the MVP for the first 4 weeks of the season. And now the Bills are averaging just 16 points per game their last 2 weeks. And versus KC, Allen was atrocious, including going 0 of 5 with an interception on throws over 15 yards. That's pathetic. But hey, here come the Jets, who somehow in 2020 are starting Joe Flacco at QB and Frank Gore at running back in 2020.
I briefly forgot that the Jets existed because I was like, who do the Bills even play this week? Because that's how I have to feel about the Jets, that they do not exist at all.
But seriously, how do you start Joe Flacco and Frank Gore in 2020? We don't have to spend a lot of time on this. I only really bring it up because we talked so much about the Bills last week. And the fact that it's one of my favorite things to talk about, and I'm being super facetious here, the double-digit spread of the Bills being favored by 13, but it's against the Jets. So I'm going to happily take the Bills here.
Okay, and that's, listen, I'm not going to be like, what? Not betting on the Jets? How dare you? That's ridiculous. A couple things, right? You're right. Josh Allen was more disappointing last week than Andy Dalton was.
Yeah.
Flat out, right? I tweeted early on in the game, if Josh Allen wants to mix in a throw that's anywhere near his receivers, he's welcome to do so. And it's is it the weather? What's the situation? I'm the guy played at Wyoming, right? He's seen weather before. Now, that being said, the knock on Josh Allen was that he wasn't very accurate in college. So I'm like, well, maybe that's because he played in Wyoming and he doesn't actually like the cold weather, the wet weather, or anything like that, right? Like maybe he would be a lot more accurate if he played at Miami in warm temperatures all the time, because that certainly was the case in the first 4 weeks when he was playing in warm temperatures, right? Like maybe he's just that guy. That would be unfortunate for a Bills quarterback, right? And that was always kind of the thing, going like an inaccurate guy in Buffalo where it can be windy, where it can be rainy, all of that kind of thing. Like that's really concerning, right? And I don't think that Josh Allen went to Wyoming because he was like, I love playing in the cold weather, right? Like he was an under-recruited guy, obviously, or he would have gone to somewhere in the South, right? So it's not, I don't think it was by choice. And obviously it wasn't necessarily by choice that he got drafted by the Bills. It just so happens that both places he went ended up being extremely cold weather type places, right? Now, he threw some really good balls in those deep passes that he didn't connect on, right? And you have to give Kansas City's defense some credit too, that they were able to get some hands in there, right? There was that one where they threw the flag for pass interference, and it probably wasn't pass interference, but it's like, when have you ever seen somebody throw a flag and then be like, nah, just kidding? Like that doesn't really happen. So that was a little bit frustrating for those of us who are on the Bills. And by the way, like we were on the Bills, talked about getting +6, right? Like even though the line was like 4.5, when we probably talked about this last week, it was like, wait. And that game was right on 6. And we were a Chiefs first down away from them just taking knees and the game being over. So it was weird. It was that gambler sort of situation where you go, oh, I've been cheering against Kansas City this whole time, but now I have to cheer for Kansas City to get the close that out. Now, all of that is to say, like, that's all more important probably than this game going forward. All I would say about that is, like, the line's too high. Yeah. It just is, right? But that it has to be because of where we are with the Jets right now, right? As the media and everybody starts piling up onto the Jets, we do just have to realize that, like, it's getting out of control. My line's about 10, right? I make it 9.5 or so. I had it 7 if Sam Darnold plays. So we're looking at, you know, let's say a 3-point adjustment from Darnold to Flacco. Maybe it needs to be even a little bit more, say 4. That still only puts us at 11. We're looking at 13.5 right now. And to me, there's no reason why we're not going to see 14 on Sunday. Sure. And I'm going to say it to you, and I'm going to try to do it with a straight face. I think I'm going to bet the Jets this weekend. I think Jets +14 is like at that point, from a numbers standpoint, we're requiring a Bills team who you just said has averaged 16 points a game. We're now essentially asking them to win by 16 when we're talking about a 14-point spread. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm saying 14 is the number. +14, not 13.5, not 13, not like +14, right? Because then, as we talk about all the time, right, you now need 3 scores to win. And this is a team that's averaged only 3 scores in these games. And again, I talked about on my podcast, right? Like, I like Kansas City to get about mid-20s, right? They'll roll out of bed and they'll score 25 points, so to speak. Yep. And it's like, can the Bills get 25 points-ish on the Chiefs defense? And I was like, yeah, I think they can. And so the disappointment was that they weren't able to do that, right? So if they're not able to do that against the Chiefs defense, right? Like the Jets defense, not great, but it's not atrocious, right? So like, how many points are this Bills offense on a short week? Are they really going to score? Now they might score 27 and then shut the Jets out, but that's not what we saw from the Bills defense this past week. And Definitely when your run defense stinks, like, Joe Flacco just has to turn and hand the ball off. And I know it's Frank Gore and, you know, and a collection of other guys, but like, if the Jets just turn and hand it off 40 times to 3 different guys, like, I kind of like their chances to cover, right? And all it would take is maybe 5 throws from Joe Flacco.
I mean, yeah,
I know it's not comfortable.
I know it's not comfortable at all. I'll just say this. I like the Bills here just in the sense that I see this being, hey, everything's fine with Josh Allen. No need to worry anymore. Like, it's just a perfect time to be playing the Jets. And this number stuck out to me the most. Josh Allen, 1-7 against teams that are 3 or more games over 500, including the playoffs. The Jets are not 3 games over 500.
No, and the Jets aren't winning this game either. The Jets aren't going to win the game either. And
so
that's
we're talking numbers, and
14.
I just see the confidence coming back to Mr. Josh Allen, where he's running around and he's feeling good about himself. He connects on some of those deep balls to Stephon Diggs instead of missing them. Cole Beasley might want to catch some first downs here and there. But hey, Bills getting back to business. We spent too much time talking about this game, which is my fault for sure for even bringing it up. And I don't even want to really bring up the Jags and Chargers game either, because I don't really have anything on that. I'll just take the points because whatever, who cares? But
take the points because Anthony Lynn is more than a touchdown favorite, right? Like, it's simple as that. Like, what else do we want to say about it, right? Like, it's like, you're going to lay 7.5 points with Anthony Lynn? Listen, they might win. They might win in a blowout because the Jags just aren't very good. But it's just like, that's just a long-term strategy that's not going to work. In the same way that, like, laying 2 touchdowns with a Bills team that's averaging 16 points is a long-term strategy that isn't going to work out, even if in both cases the games end up being blowouts, right? You just sort of have to live with that from a betting standpoint.
Like it, love it. We kind of already discussed the survivor pick of the week being the Eagles. Hopefully this podcast is out in time for people to jump on board and take the Eagles. I'm going to personally challenge myself to make that happen. So hopefully you are listening to this podcast before.
We might just be ruining people's survivor leagues throughout the entire continent right now.
For sure.
But yeah.
And we sprinkled a little bit of sucker bets in there for you as well. We got that house cleaning out of the way. But in terms of where people can get more whole grain goodness from you, Mr. Matt Russell, please give people the info, because on Twitter, you're handing out winners in all sports. Obviously, we're in the middle of the World Series right now, so I know you're following along closely to that. But also, as mentioned, so much football info on the Window podcast and on your Twitter account. Give the people the information of where they can find more of the knowledge that you're dropping in these streets.
Yeah, man. It's the Window podcast right here. Look for this logo. Just type in the Window Sports. We talk about, if you type in just the Window, you might end up with some sort of spirituality, karmic type, work on yourself type of thing. No, we're talking about the Window. It's called the Window for a couple different reasons. One of them, the main one, is that the window at the sports book is where you go to make your bets, right? Mm-hmm. And so, yes, we give out most of the bets on there. We get into some stuff at Emrus Authentic on Twitter, right? I don't just put the plays out there because I'm a little greedy. I need you. I want you to listen to the podcast.
For sure.
That's where most of the picks are, right? But we get into sort of time turnarounds and stuff. Saturdays, I put the college football stuff out on Twitter on a day-to-day basis, right? We put the podcast out early. Well, we do the podcast in the morning, comes out around noon. Stuff happens throughout the day. So if something like that happens, and I'm the first one to admit, A, when I get something wrong, or B, when I screw something up from a podcast standpoint. And right now in the World Series, I forgot to mention that I made a bet. Now, normally I talk about every single bet that I make, right? Whether it's on the podcast or on Twitter. Mm-hmm. And I completely forgot to mention Brandon Lau for the Tampa Bay Rays as 33-1 MVP in that series, right? And I'm on the Rays, right? Because, various reasons, but mostly because the number was just too high. And we're sitting here at a 1-1 series, and who knows how it's going to go, but we're still at least feeling okay about that bet. Now, Brandon Lau goes and hits 2 home runs last night in the Rays win, and I'm like, oh, God, I really and listen, I don't know that he's going to win the MVP. I certainly don't really think that he is.
But it's a great start.
Right? But it's an example of a thing that, like, normally I talk about, normally I give it out, and I just flat out forgot in this situation. So I'm taking the L, even if I take the W, and I'm happy to take the W and the L in this situation. But that's just kind of the stuff that we get into, which, like, even if it doesn't work out, right? If you were sitting there with a Brandon Lau 33-1 ticket, and he hits 2 home runs, they may never win another game in this series, but at least for that one day, we feel really good about it. And most of sports betting is having fun watching the game. So that's what we try to do. We get in, we deep dive a little further on all of this stuff on a daily basis. You have to, if you're going to do a daily podcast. Friday is the big NFL show that everybody sort of tunes into the most. And then Sunday is the official, like, these are my picks. This is what I'm sort of, betting on. This is what I'm grading on. We talk teasers. We talk underdog money lines, which we almost made a gajillion dollars on last week. But almost said the R word, but the Washington football team didn't get that 2-point conversion. And Cincinnati blew the lead to Indy. And if we had hit both of those, which we very easily could have given the game situation, we would be McDucking, right? We would be diving into balloons in our silo of money out back, and it would have been fantastic. So all of that happens on Sunday. 18, 11, and 1 right now in circa million. So, not showing off, but not falling behind. We're in sort of the top, 90th percentile. So a ton of season left to go there. And gosh, hopefully we can get the Eagles home tonight and survive for the week so that we're sitting pretty and just hoping for a bloodbath this Sunday. I know that you're hoping for that as one of the friends of the podcast who are involved in that entry.
Listen, I gotta set a reminder in my phone to make sure that I take the Eagles in Survivor, because after going through all of these games, I'm looking around and I'm kind of like, oh, wait a second.
Yeah, we're not loving the Eagles, right? It's
no,
like,
for sure.
What are our other options, right?
Totally.
And it's like, I don't want to fade Teddy Bridgewater going with the Saints.
No.
And, as much as we sort of talk about KC and the snow against Denver being sort of a legitimate option, it's more like I kind of rather just saving KC for the Jets next week and being able to put up our feet before the game even starts in that one. So, a lot of it was sort of by default.
And I think I might have taken the Bills already, but I don't know. I got to take a look at all that. But either way, options aplenty. And, again, on Twitter, find all the whole grain goodness from Mr. Matt Russell. You can find me on Twitter at Sheldon Alexander. Same thing goes for Instagram at Sheldon Alexander. And basically you follow those places because once I put out my full picks for the week, as we continue to stay above 500 and win more than we lose, you can find those picks. The full picks are up every week. If the podcast comes out Thursday night or Friday, the full picks are made a little bit after that. But either way, check those out. Chirp me. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you dislike. And when you listen to the pod, also, let us know what you think of the podcast, what you agree with, what you disagree with, what you liked, what you didn't like, all of that, because we really appreciate it here on this podcast as well. And like and subscribe wherever you've been liking and subscribing, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Google Play, YouTube. Really appreciate it. Whether you like the videos, do you guys like the little video clips we've been putting out? Anything, we're here. We're here to find out whatever information to try to help everyone just grow the community and win some money. Just trying to help everybody out, right?
That's all that matters.
Nothing wrong with that at all. So for another week, this is week 7. Good luck. Happy shmoney dancing for everybody. Hopefully the winners, we all get some winners this week. We continue the ride that is winning money. As I always say each and every week to close out the podcast, I used to pray for times like this, to rhyme like this. This is, I'll name this football pod later, part of the On Blast Podcast Network. As always, unpolished and unapologetic. Until next time, see ya.
On Blast.